welcome to the Majlis podcast, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's current affairs talk show focusing on Central Asia. I'm Bruce Pannier, host of the Majlis and author of the weekly Central Asia in Focus newsletter. Our topic in this session of the Majlis is the recent signs of warming ties between Iran and the Central Asian states. Iran's relations with the countries of Central Asia have seen their ups and downs over the course of the last 30 years, but the Tajik president made an official visit at the end of May, and in June the Turkmen president, then the Kazakh president also visited. And the Iranian president was just in Turkmen capital Ashgabat on June 29th for the Summit of Caspian States, which included the leaders of Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan. To discuss all this, I'm joined by Nicole Grajewski. She's a doctoral candidate, but candidate for only a week longer, I might add, at University of Oxford and postdoctoral researcher at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfair Center doing research on Iran-Russian relations and Iran's foreign policy in Central Asia. Alex Vatanka is the director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and author of the recently published book, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States, Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since 1979. Francisco Olmos is a London-based researcher specializing in Central Asian affairs. He is Geopol 21's main researcher covering the post-Soviet space and a research fellow at the Foreign Policy Center. He's written articles for specialized media on Central Asia, such as The Diplomat, Oxford Society, and The Political Room. Thank you all for joining me today. I appreciate you all being here. And Alex, I want to start with you, if I could. Could you give us the view from Iran? What might Iranian authorities, what might the Iranian government be seeking from better ties with Central Asia?
Thank you, Bruce. Look, I think this government of Ebrahim Raisi is doing two things at the moment. Number one is they desperately need to look for new economic opportunities, trade opportunities, and generally break their geopolitical isolation the way they see it. And now the Central Asian states, from Iran's perspective, is relatively friendly territory. And I think that's what, is pushing Iran forward. How much trade and investment they can get out of it in the short term remains to be seen, but doubtful it's going to be in a significant amounts of money. Certainly not going to change Iranian economic fortunes overnight. I also think there's a political dimension to this. The Raisi government, if you look at the Iranian media coverage of, for example, his visit to Ashgabat that you just referenced, so much of this is about petty politics, unfortunately, in Tehran. It's to suggest that Raisi and his foreign policy team have a strategic vision going forward with the Central Asian states, that unlike the previous government of Hassan Rouhani, which they argue, the Raisi team would argue, was fixated on the question of how to improve relations with the West, they have a much better vision for Iran's what they call neighborhood policy. The Central Asian states will be a component of that. But as I said before, there will be some momentum. There certainly is momentum. If you just look at the data, there is momentum. There's an increase in trade. But in terms of the long-term vision, we have to wait and see because and I'll stop here, but the key momentum here, I think it's what is going on in Ukraine. The Central Asian states need to look for alternative routes for their trade. We know that is a hard fact that the Central Asian states are dealing with. And Iran is an alternative. It's an important major alternative for them. So I think that is providing momentum. But that doesn't necessarily mean that Iran has thought through exactly what it wants to achieve vis-a-vis the Central Asian states. It might be something that they're thinking about, but it needs to be implemented. And we won't really see the results of that for some time to come. But I thought that was the sort of big picture that I see in terms of how things are moving forward, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. Nicole, would you comment on the same question, please?
Yeah, I tend to take a bit of a different perspective to this, is that I think for a long time, the Iranian successive governments have sought to form ties with the Central Asian states. And this has been marred by a series of political sensitivities within the region, especially with Uzbekistan and at times with Tajikistan. But even as early as, even last year, actually, Zarif's visit in April of 2021 to Central Asia kind of indicated this push, even from the Rouhani administration, towards potentially forming more ties and at the time, hopefully without sanctions under the JCPOA, Trump administration, JCPOA sanctions. But with this current push with Raisi, obviously it fits into the Look East policy. But it is focusing on the one thing that Iran really has to leverage with the Central Asian states, and that's economic connectivity, Iran's access to alternate markets. And at the time right now, especially with the current situation in Ukraine, this provides an alternate to Russia. But at the same time, the lack of banking channels, and there's also difficulties between the business communities and tariffs between the governments. There's a lot of impediments to this as well. So I think we should be cautious to overstate the significance of these visits, but they do represent perhaps one of the bigger pushes towards Central Asia that we've seen recently.
And if I could just have a follow-up question on that real quick. It's no secret, of course, that Iran and Russia have pretty good relations, and they, in terms of foreign policy, they view things kind of the same way. Any comments on how Russia might see Iran's, new warming of ties with Central Asia? I mean, because it really does kind of come at the expense of Russian trade routes that Central Asians have been using.
Well, officially, Iran's been trying to portray this as part of the North-South transport corridor, which links up to Russia's view of Greater Eurasia. And Iran's been pretty careful on its ties to Central Asia. It does implicitly recognize Russia's privileged role in the region. I think one thing is with the recent drone agreement with Tajikistan, which is quite significant. Iran's made a lot of progress in terms of UAV technology, and we saw this in the Persian Gulf in 2019. And how Iran could potentially provide some kind of security assistance to Tajikistan, that may be viewed with a bit of skepticism in Moscow. Though in general, I think Russia and Iran, their relationship has been dictated by this mutual antagonism towards the West. And I don't think that Iran would be willing to put itself in a position to, damage those ties at the expense of closer partnerships with the Central Asian states.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to get to Fran here, but I also would remind everybody that if you want to comment on anything you've heard, or if you have a point that you want to add on to something that you've heard, then please jump in when you have a chance. Fran, you just wrote an article for the Diplomat magazine about busy times in Iranian-Central Asian relations. What do you think the Central Asian states are looking for from improved relations with Iran?
Well, I think there's three main components. One of them was touched upon before, which is the connectivity that Iran can provide in terms of from Central Asia towards the Middle East and further afield. So we recently saw a train that traveled from northeastern Kazakhstan and is due to arrive in southern Turkey, of course, crossing Turkmenistan and Iran. So that was much publicized during Tokayev's visit to Iran. So connectivity is a component. It's not a new component. The Kazakh-Turkmen railway has been there since 2014, and Central Asian states use mostly the Bandar Abbas port in Iran. But that's let's say the oldest component of this relationship. Then there's a second component, which probably the catalyst was what happened last year in Afghanistan, which is security, especially with Tajikistan. As Nicole mentioned, there was this joint agreement to build a plant in Tajikistan for Iranian drones. And then we have seen the special envoy of Iran in Afghanistan do the rounds in June. He was in Tajikistan on the 23rd of June, met with the foreign minister. A couple of days later, he was in Tashkent, met with the Uzbek foreign minister. And a couple of days later, he was in Kyrgyzstan, meeting with the Kyrgyz foreign minister. So, of course, the situation in Afghanistan and the emergence of militant groups is something that is, I think, also serves as a catalyst in this relationship. We saw the minister of Tajikistan mentioning when he met the chief of staff of the Iranian armed forces about joint military exercises, and always referring regarding terrorism, which in this case I think is a term for insurgent and militant groups in Afghanistan. And then there's a third aspect, which is the energy aspect, especially for Turkmenistan. So reaching other markets further afield in terms of gas through swaps, currently Azerbaijan. There are talks also with Armenia. And also, who knows if the debt is settled between Iran and Turkmenistan, we might see exports of Turkmen gas to Iran, not just as swaps, but for Iran's own consumption.
Great. Thank you very much. Alex, I want to get to you on the Afghanistan section. I mean, how much cooperation can Iran expect from the Central Asian governments? Can you give me an idea of the level? And I know it changes from country to country. But for instance, the Tajikistan, the Tajik government is pretty vehemently anti-Taliban. I mean, they're unwilling to engage with them on any high levels at all. Whereas the other Central Asian governments have at least started a dialogue with that Taliban in Afghanistan. How much room is there for cooperation on Afghanistan between Iran and the Central Asian states?
Number one to point out is Iran too is having a dialogue with the Taliban. It's not a straightforward one, but they're having a dialogue. But there are hiccups all the time. Just this week, another Iranian border guard was shot and killed by the Taliban on the border. This does not help. The confidence isn't there. On a rhetorical level, Tehran is saying that they want to deal with this Taliban, reality and power in Kabul. We saw evidence of that again recently with the earthquake in Afghanistan. The Iranians were one of the first ones in terms of foreign donors to send shipment in. So they are trying on the Iranian side to see if this Taliban is different from the Taliban of the 1990s. But that doesn't mean they don't share exactly the same sorts of doubts and reservations that the Tajiks have about the Taliban. And I'm sure Afghanistan and what happens in that country is a key reason why you've seen the shift in relations between Iran and Tajikistan in the last few, certainly the last 2 years or so. I think the Iranians, while they wait and see, will be worried about the security vacuum, as we discussed, particularly in terms of anything that looks like the Taliban version 1.0. So, which would in these days, 2022, basically mean a more anti-Iran, anti-Shia movement, which Taliban today claims not to be. So the alternative to Taliban today, if you're anti-Iran, anti-Shia, is to join up with the ISIS Khorasan. Iran will watch the development there very closely, what they call, jihadi, Salafist anti-Iran movements. And right now, the ISIS Khorasan is the biggest one. Again, that sort of a trend, if it goes in that direction, that would create reason for Iran to want to look for cooperation with anybody that shares that concern. And I mean, in the past, we've seen Iran cooperate with India, Russia, and the Central Asian states. Something similar could happen again. It wouldn't be against the Taliban if Taliban remains true what it's saying today, that it's changed, but it would begin against emerging militant Islamist threats, like, as I said, ISIS Khorasan. So the Iranians are keeping their options open here, but let us not kid ourselves. There is plenty of doubt and concerns in Tehran when it comes to the future of Afghanistan. And surely they're looking to work with like-minded regional states if the circumstances call for it.
Great, thank you. Fran, I'm going to get back to you for a second. Turkmenistan and Iran have kind of a different policy toward the Taliban, a little bit. The Turkmen are certainly more neutral, I would say, if nothing else. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think when it comes to in this regard, I don't think Turkmenistan will play a part when it comes to Afghanistan. They will cooperate or deal with any government there, whether it was Taliban or the regime before that. The regime with Iran in this case is not centered in Afghanistan, and we saw it at least publicly. The Iranian special envoy was not in Turkmenistan meeting with the foreign minister as it was in other countries. So it's not the main component on the relationship. Here the cooperation is more the transit and the energy component of Turkmenistan, looking basically for new markets or export routes, not only of gas, but potentially also of electricity, which it already exports to Kyrgyzstan and actually Afghanistan. So I don't think in the Turkmen case, Afghanistan plays an important role, which it does play, as we mentioned before, with Tajikistan.
Yes, Nicole, please. Do you have a comment?
Well, I wanted to add that Iran's been active in several of the initiatives, the diplomatic initiatives, the Chinese-led initiative, especially on the neighboring countries of Afghanistan plus Russia. And then also with the SEO contact group, you can think about the Iranian admission to the SEO or the announcement of admission in September 2021 as kind of an indication of perhaps Iran's bigger role in this. Of course, the amount of influence or that the SEO contact group or the Chinese-led diplomatic forums have have on this is yet to be seen and is unlikely to significantly influence the situation. But it is significant to the extent that Iran has been involved in these forums with the Central Asian states and have at least had forums for dialogue on many of these issues. And in general, I think what is quite known within Central Asia is this emphasis on stability, and Iran tends to share that. So there is that point of commonality. And at the same time, with the kind of movement of narco trafficking, which is something very important for at least Iran and Russia in particular, this could potentially be an area where you might see more cooperation.
Let me ask you to comment on this. You know, when the Central Asian states became independent in the early 1990s, at that time, Iran was viewed as the extremist state, right? They were the fanatical Muslims that a lot of the Central Asian states were worried about. But in your opinion, has that view changed? And is it because Iran's changed, or is it because we've seen worse groups show up in Afghanistan?
Well, I think the issue with Iran and Turkey in the early 1990s, which was often floated by the Russians and also Central Asian states about Iran exporting its model or exporting the revolution in the region, that subsided around mid-1993 with the Tajik Civil War and Iran's involvement in that, but also with Iran's recognition that Russia's kind of playing this role. So Iran did take a step back from kind of pursuing really major cultural initiatives or any kind of models of development. And partly because of Islam Karimov's hostility towards that and also this securitization of the Iranian threat. But Iran tends to also share a lot of the same terrorist groups as a lot of the Central Asian states. So Hizb ut-Tahrir is something that Iran is stated does not support that kind of brand of Wahhabism. Iran and many of the Central Asian states share a common view of using domestic groups as potentially extremist organizations. So on that end, I think that there's actually some kind of like-minded partnership going on there, where there is externalizing internal sources of instability as kind of a source as a way of kind of repressing these kind of movements as well.
Okay, and Alex, you wanted to add something, please?
I just wanted to add that, since independence for the Central Asian states, the last 30 years, I mean, in our travels that I have certainly made over the decades, a couple of things have always been there in terms of major factors that shape how the Central Asian states look at the Islamic Republic. One is the regime in Tehran's essentially nature. That was always a concern. I remember in my travels in Central Asia, I was often told that they would tell me that they worried about Pakistan more than they would worry about Iran, just because Iran was a Shia majority country and a Sunni majority Muslim population. They didn't think Iran had a natural way in. But the Iranian Islamist model was a concern for some of the states in Central Asia more so than others, but it was always a factor that prevented the cultural geographic proximity to play its part and make economic integration for Iran and the Central Asian states so much more smoother than has been the case. The other reality, that elephant in the room, is the constant U.S. pressure on these states for the last 30 years, always telling them that keep Iran at bay till the Iranian side has a complete dialogue with the United States and the West. So there's been that pressure that I think is still to some extent is in play. But the third factor that I think is changing to some extent, at least in the short term, as evident by the visits by Central Asian leaders to Iran, is the geopolitical changes that we see. The reality is the Ukraine war has created the necessity for these Central Asian states to look for alternative ways to world markets. There are always going to be an element of hedging on the parts of Iran's neighbors. I'm sure as countries in the broader Middle East, Central Asia look to a possibility of an Iranian new nuclear deal, and Iran maybe, it's a big maybe, but it's still there as a potential, rejoining the world economy. They want to be there to take advantage of that. But I say this as well, Bruce. This is important. Those of us who've been covering Iran know that Iran's economy could be in a different place than it is today had the authorities in Tehran made some other foreign policy choices and prioritized the state of their economy. I don't see in Ibrahim Raisi a strategic economic vision that's different going forward. I think there's a lot of politics involved here. I think there's a lot of hope on the part of the Central Asian states. But end of the day, much of what we're discussing here, whether it's energy trade, transit routes, all the rest of it, so much of it will depend on what happens to Iran's overall standing on the international stage. The big investment, the big trade will not happen unless Iran makes a decision to go in a different direction and prioritize its economy. The Ukraine war will push Iran's agenda to some extent because it's changed the geopolitics of the region. But end of the day, it's a fundamental decision that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei and others at the top leadership in Tehran have to make. And I just don't see any signs of that. And that's why I'm a bit somewhat hesitant in terms of calling for a whole new chapter that some people are claiming is about to happen.
And thank you very much for mentioning Russia's war on Ukraine and the need for new trade routes, because that's what I want to get into in the second part of the podcast, which means this is a great opportunity for me to make another pitch for the podcast and introduce our guests again. This is the RFARL's Majlis podcast. It's a weekly show that looks at affairs in Central Asia. Today's topic is Iran, Central Asia, and relations. And I am joined today by Alex Vatanka, director of the Iran program at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and author of the recently published book, The Battle of the Ayatollahs in Iran, the United States Foreign Policy and Political Rivalry since 1979. Francisco Olmos is a London-based researcher specializing in Central Asian affairs. He is Geopol 21's main researcher covering the post-Soviet space and research fellow at the Foreign Policy Center. He has written articles for specialized media on Central Asia, such as The Diplomat, Oxford Society, and Political Room. And we have Nicole Graevsky, currently a doctoral candidate, not for much longer. We'll be looking forward to calling her Dr. Nicole in the very near future, at the University of Oxford, and a postdoctoral researcher at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center, doing research on Iran, Russian relations, and Iran's foreign policy in Central Asia. Fran, let's get down to the connectivity part of this. I mean, that seems to be one of the things that's driving this warmer relationship between Iran and the Central Asians. I mean, how important is it for Central Asia to be able to have greater access to Iran, if for no other reason than as a transit country?
Yes, I mean, thank you, Bruce. Iran as a transit port from Central Asia has been there for quite a while. I would say, I mean, Uzbekistan under Mirziyoyev, one of his main objectives in foreign policy is to be able to connect Uzbekistan with ports in the south. First, he looked at Iran, then he looked at Pakistan. He's been quite a champion of that. So we have the project of the Trans-Afghan Railway to reach Pakistan. But of course, currently it's Iran for him. I would say the connectivity principle I mentioned before, it's been there for quite some time. The Kazakh Terminal Railway has been there for now 8 years. But again, each country has a different view on it. I think currently Kazakhstan, because of the war in Ukraine that we mentioned, is the one that's probably the most interested in this southern route. I mean, Uzbekistan has been interested for a while, but as of the last months, probably it's more important for Kazakhstan. We saw the train leave Pavlodar a few weeks ago. Now there's talks of linking that with China, potentially a Chinese train, then going through Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Iran, and eventually Turkey. So it's going to be important for Kazakhstan because of Russia, the state of affairs, the sanctions that Russia has to face. So finding an alternative is always a positive step. Now, the problem is this is not something that's going to be achieved in the short term. It will take some time. So it won't be a viable alternative. It will be an alternative, but not the main alternative in the near future for Kazakhstan. For Tajikistan, it's not that important in terms of they don't have that connection done. Kyrgyzstan has more interest in the China-Uzbekistan Kyrgyzstan Railway, which is still in the drawing room. And for Turkmenistan, it's mostly about connectivity in terms of energy. But of course, it's the second key component of any connectivity with Iran, as all railways have to go through Turkmenistan, whether they come from Uzbekistan or Kazakhstan, is going to be the key component going forward towards the West, Iran and the Middle East. So, just to summarize, like we were saying, it's important. It's always been important. The war in Ukraine has made it even more important for Kazakhstan specifically. But I don't think in the short term it's going to be something that we're going to see in taking over from other commercial routes.
And just for the benefit of our audience, too, there already is existing trade. I mean, the U.S. has exempted a couple of the countries in Central Asia from sanctions on Iran. Can you talk a little bit about what moves from Central Asia through Iran right now?
Yeah, so currently what we do see is freight coming again through Turkmenistan. Turkmenistan has trade with Iran. Also is the transit through Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, but the actual amount of goods is not that relevant at this moment in time. So, even though the trade is taking place, I don't think the commercial aspect is going to be the most relevant in Iranian-Central Asian relations. It's going to be more the transit and the energy aspects of it. But I don't expect Iran to become an important destination of Central Asian exports or vice versa in the short term, nor in the midterm. I think they're two different economics in that regard.
But given one last point, given Turkmenistan's dire economic situation, even barter trade with Iran is an improvement over the situation they got right now. Do you see that growing?
Of course, in Turkmenistan's point of view, let's say every little helps, whether it's barter trade, or any other sort of trade. But again, I think Turkmenistan is pressing quite hard for improving or increasing the swap deals with Azerbaijan, open a new one probably with Armenia. There's negotiations between Iran and Armenia going on. And of course, getting that $1.8 billion US dollars that Iran is working to pay Turkmenistan back. But of course, for especially those people living on the border regions, barter trade is important. The only thing is the pandemic it did for a couple of years put an end to it. Slowly, we're seeing Turkmenistan open again, not only with commercial flights, but some months ago, it started allowing truck drivers to cross through Turkmenistan. Before that, let's say Turkmen drivers had to take over their Iranian colleagues. So, we're starting to see the resumption of trade at every level, but I don't think it's going to be enough to fill in the coffers, let's say, of Turkmenistan. That will only be done by probably gas and to a much lesser extent electricity. But for that, infrastructure still needs to be built anyway.
Then I do want to keep on connectivity, but Nicole, I have a question for you too. You mentioned the nuclear talks on Iran. Kazakhstan actually hosted a lot of those talks. Do you see Kazakhstan playing any kind of role in the future talks on the nuclear program? And if so, is this just a disinterested, benevolent party that's trying to do it, or do you think Kazakhstan is also looking for into the future and seeing that there's a potential for a trade route through Iran?
Yeah, the talks were in, I think, of February 2013 in Almaty. There has actually been parallels with the current talks in Qatar over the JCPOA as kind of similar to the talks that were held in Almaty in between these major big negotiations. Well, for Kazakhstan in particular, this non-proliferation narrative is pretty central to Kazakh identity, partly because of its experience in formerly possessing nuclear weapons and giving them up. But there was a real interest, especially during the Ahmadinejad administration, from the Kazakhs in curtailing Iranian nuclear ambitions. At the moment, Kazakhstan's stated goal was non-proliferation. It's unlikely that Kazakhstan will serve as an intermediary, partly because I think the United States and other European nations might see Kazakhstan as being too close and representing the Russian perspective. However, there is a uranium fuel bank, an IAEA fuel bank in Kazakhstan that has often been used or discussed as being used as a potential place to put Iran's excess fuel. So that could potentially come into play, but there's been difficulties on that, especially between agreement on where Iran's excess uranium will end up. But it's unlikely, in short.
Okay, thank you. And Alex, I'm going to ask you the same question too. Do you see Kazakhstan or any other Central Asian country playing any kind of role in Iran's nuclear talks with the West?
I think they do obviously have a stake in this because one thing that has always been apparent to me is that Central Asian officials and even, analysts and so forth that I've spoken to over the years have a sense that, this is a normal country taken essentially, and I hope I'm not being provocative, but taken hostage by a political gang that just doesn't want to integrate in terms of international economics and even regional economics. So there's this sense that you get talking to Central Asian leaders and analysts that it's just a question of time that Iran will come and become a core player in terms of trade and as a hub in Western Asia, and the Central Asian states want to be there for that day. What I think it's very attractive. When you look at the map, you cannot avoid Iran. And there are all sorts of other drivers right now that are pushing this momentum. I mean, just stepping away from Central Asia for a second, if you look at, for example, what the Gulf states are doing right now with Iran, they're considering Iran as a transit route to Turkey using trucks in this case. There's a lot being done on this. And, one of the reasons is pure commercial logic. Suez Canal is expensive. Getting your goods to Europe from South Asia through Iran on trucks is actually much more cheaper based on some of the studies that have been done. But look, put all this aside, Bruce. There's a lot of logic that you could bring to a conversation about what Central Asian states could get out of closer commercial ties with Iran. There's a lot to be said. There's a lot to be gained there. But I go back to a point I made earlier. You need to get the politics of this straight. When we're talking about trade, it's not the case anymore that states just simply sign agreements and you have your goods go through a territory. You have companies involved. You have private entities involved that need to do their due diligence. Do they want to have their goods on back of a truck that goes from, say, India through Iran to Europe when they have to worry about American or even European sanctions? These are the real obstacles in the way and the solution to that is not in Central Asia. The solution to that is if Tehran manages, in the short term, to reach a nuclear deal with the United States and other powers, and B, quickly looks for ways to politically reduce the tensions across the board with so many of its own neighbors. Now, I'm not putting all the blame at the door of Iran. It takes a number of states in the region to have that broader dialogue, but it's essentially a political discussion. There's a political solution. It's not about whether transit routes or energy swaps make sense. They make total sense. And the Iranians actually have, they have a deputy foreign minister, Mehdi Safari, whose job is exactly that, who is right now negotiating with the Central Asian states. But at the end of the day, he can create the commercial logic for it, put everything in front of the politicians. But there's a supreme leader in Tehran who might say, well, if it takes me to have to say to the American yes to A and B and C, then I won't play game. Well, that would be the end of that conversation. So I think, we should keep in mind the politics of this needs to be resolved at the highest level. And once that's taken care of, an Iran that is an integrated part of the region will happen very fast because it's a natural player. It has a lot to offer, and it can also offer neighboring states in terms of what they can do together economically.
Thank you. Okay, I'll ask one more question, and I'd like everyone to comment on it, and then I'll give you a chance to make any comments you want. That you think we've missed some points. The Russia's war in Ukraine is not going to end anytime soon. And Central Asia is going to need to find new trade routes. So you were just talking about that, Alex. I think everyone's touched on that a little bit. Is connectivity the basis for a new kind of Iranian-Central Asian relationship? Understanding that, the war in Ukraine doesn't seem to show any signs of ending anytime soon. One would imagine that if it did end with a Russian victory or partial victory out there, that the sanctions against Russia would still last for many, many years. So Central Asia is kind of pressed into a corner where they're going to have, literally practically, into a corner where they're going to have to find new trade routes. So my question is connectivity the basis of a friendship? Nicole, you want to start?
I think the Iranians have long touted their potential to foster connectivity with the Central Asian states, but Iranian railways itself need to go under significant modernization, and that's faced a lot of setbacks due to the Trump administration's sanctions and also sanctions on Russia, which was funding a part of a significant rail project. But I think that could provide a basis. It's yet to be seen. Obviously, Iran's port of Chabahar, where Uzbekistan has recently signed an MOU on potentially establishing a base there, as well as other Central Asian countries have also expressed interest from Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. So there are these kind of not primary trade relations or primary economic relations, but that could help provide a more durable basis for this relationship. I think that a lot of the natures of the internal regimes, both with Iran and also the Central Asian states, the concern about stability, internal stability and regime security is also a potential area where you can see some cooperation between the countries. But in general, there's quite a bit of difficulties, and they've been talking about connectivity since the early 1990s, and we're just now seeing some more movement. But it's yet to be seen whether the war in Ukraine will be the final impetus to actually see it coming to fruition.
Thank you very much. And Fran, just a few minutes ago, you mentioned that they were looking at the route that goes through Afghanistan to Pakistan, right? So this already shows that the Central Asians are setting a precedent where they're willing to overlook a lot of things for the benefit of connectivity. So do you see them doing something similar with Iran?
Yes, I mean, I think to answer to your question before, connectivity will be the basis in the medium term or longer term, but just as long as it economically it makes sense and is profitable. Also politically, as we know, in the last 5 years, the Central Asian states have been collaborating regionally, much more than before. But these countries or the government are prone to, makes us every now and then things difficult in the border with neighboring countries, sometimes due to personal relationships between presidents and so on. So, of course, for connectivity to work, is all the components in the chain have to be, on the same boat, so to speak. And economically, it has to be viable. I mean, they say 12 days for a train from northeastern Kazakhstan to southern Turkey. Now, if that's more profitable than other routes, then connectivity will be an important component. But, like you mentioned, if eventually the Trans-Afghan Railway gets built, and, it's a big if once again, but and if Uzbekistan sees that it's actually more profitable or it's cheaper to get goods through Pakistani ports, then, in this case, Iran will fall into the background for Uzbek ambitions and potentially for other countries in the region. So at the end of the day, it will all depend on the economics and how profitable or viable these trade routes through Iran will be.
And Alex, to you, and like we just were mentioning, that Central Asians are no strangers to trading with or through pariah states. Do you think connectivity is the basis for a new Iranian-Central Asian relationship?
No, I agree with you, Bruce. I think that has been the case. I mean, I mentioned American pressure to keep Iran out, and I think that has been true. And the integration between Iran and the Central Asian states definitely has been limited due to U.S. pressure on the Central Asian states. But nonetheless, the Central Asian states never shut the door. And there's always been trade, not necessarily significant. There's always been trade. And in terms of, I guess the question we have to ask here is, when it comes to the issue of Iran's relations with the Central Asian states, certainly in the economic area, there are two paths here. You can go big or you can go small. I mean, to me, going small is what we've been talking about here. I mean, swap deals between Iran and Turkmenistan, which basically, for your listeners, Iranian population is concentrated mostly in the north, closer to the Turkmen border, whereas Iranian natural gas is almost all located in the Persian Gulf. So it takes a bit of an effort to take the gas to your population centers. So the swap makes a lot of sense to buy the gas at the right time in the year when the demand is optimal, and you give, whatever, either in financial dollar terms, or you give gas for the Turkmen later on in return. And that's how the logic for the commercial activity. So that's thinking small. That's a swap that is limited essentially to bilateral relations. Or you can say, hey, hang on a minute here. Turkmenistan happens to be one of the largest reserves of natural gas on the planet. Iran has the second largest natural gas reserves on the planet. And hey, Ukraine war has meant that Europe wants to get itself off Russian gas, and they're looking for alternative places to get that gas. If the politics of this was taken care of, if Iran could politically get itself to a position where it could be considered as a source for your oil and gas, not just to China, which Iran already delivers, but to Europe, the European continent. And if they could be open so much so that European and American and others would go in and invest and bring Iranian gas production up, because people forget Iran today is one of the largest gas producers in the world, but consumes 80% of that gas internally. They could free up a lot of that gas with better technology, with investment. That could create opportunities for export if the politics of this was in play to Europe, which means dollars will come back into Iranian bank accounts. So and the Central Asian states, like countries like Turkmenistan, would benefit, Iran would benefit. But again, I go back to a point I said, you need to prioritize your state of your economy to get to this promised land, if you will. And I just don't see that strategic vision on the part of the Islamic Republic. Iranian analysts have been screaming for years and years about things could be done differently that could make Iran into a much more powerful economic player. But the foreign policy of the place still has to catch up. And until that day, I think we're going to be still playing on the margins. And I'll stop there, Bruce.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, it's time for last comments or points that anyone wants to make. And Nicole, since you are on the eve of becoming a doctor, I will let you go first.
Well, I mean, in general, I think that Iran's relations with Central Asia shouldn't be viewed as kind of homogenous. Iran has different priorities depending on each country in the region, but Iran does see Central Asia as a potential area to potentially offset some of the effects of international isolation. This still isn't a priority in Iranian foreign policy. Iran's Look East policy tends to emphasize Russia and China, and then to a lesser extent India, and then sometimes the Central Asian states are thrown in there. But and there's still somewhat of what Alex was talking about. There's still somewhat of a lack of strategic vision when it comes to its relations with countries in the region. So these trips that we've seen recently from Central Asian leaders to Tehran, they're significant. They represent somewhat of a warming of relations between Tehran and the region, but it's not determinative of a future relationship that's without problems or without obstacles. So I think to look at it with a bit of skepticism going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Fran, any points you want to make that we didn't make here?
So I think in the short term, what's going to be interesting to see is how the security links between Tajikistan and Iran develop. And there were countries that had, let's say, their ups and downs since the 90s. So let's see if we see them in the near future holding joint military exercises, how that military cooperation takes shape. And then just to reiterate the point, I think when and if Iran settles finally the debt with Turkmenistan, the opportunities that can open between both countries in terms of bilateral relations. Are we going to see Turkmenistan export gas to Iran, not as part of swap deals, as we mentioned before, but as for Iran's consumption, as it did in the past? So, in the short term, those are things that I'll be looking for. And in the long term, let's see how viable this railway connection that we mentioned from Kazakhstan all the way to Turkey becomes, and if it's going to go towards China and be profitable, or if it will be just more of a one-off sort of publicity stunt.
Okay, and Iranian-Central Asian relations. Alex, last word to you.
I mean, I've been somewhat pessimistic about all this, but you have to forgive me. I've been covering Iran for 25 years, and I've been here before, as all of us, I'm sure, have been here before. So it's important not to sort of let public announcements and declaration of agreements sort of mean that we're at the verge of something major. We could be at something major. As I said, the natural factors at play here that should enable Iran and the Central Asian states to be much closer and bigger economic partners are all there. But the politics needs to be taken care of. I guess on a positive note, what I certainly sense in the Arab world, in Middle East, not in Central Asia so much, but certainly in the Middle East, what we have seen in the last year or so is the region is moving away from the zero-sum game competition for power. The geopolitical race that, was so big part of life in the broader Middle East after the Arab Spring in 2011. Countries like Saudi Arabia, UAE, Turkey, they're all looking for economic opportunities. They're looking to rebuild at home. They're looking for spending less money in chasing geopolitical projects and creating jobs for the youth and that desperately need a job. In a country like Iran, when you got 30% of your under 25 unemployed. They need to do that. So if the Raisi government, if the Islamic Republic goes in the direction of putting the economy first, creating the conditions for investment to come in, for jobs to be created, Central Asian states can play a role in that. I don't think the Central Asian states will be a make or break it moment for the Iranians, but there could certainly be a significant economic component in terms of Iran's overall trade strategy. But again, I feel that the officials in Tehran need to make a clear decision that they actually want to, if you will, fix their economy, which requires some hard political adjustments to be made in terms of the relations with bigger players, principally the United States. Once that has been achieved, I think you can expect in the long term a whole qualitatively different relationship between Iran and the Central Asian states on the economic front. But that is only a prospect, because we could stay where we are, where trade will be limited, people will make all sorts of promises, but nothing major happens. That's the alternative.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for being on the program today. So once again, thank you, Francisco Olmos, for being on the program. And I thank you, Nicole Grajewski, for being on the program, and Alex Vatanka for being on the program. It was wonderful to have you here. And a special thanks to Nathan Shoemaker, who's our Majlis podcast producer in Washington, D.C. And a reminder that you can subscribe to the Majlis podcast or the Central Asia in Focus newsletter by visiting RFARL's website at rfarl.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back next week.